Hi, Art 112 students, Colleen here to give you an overview of our first discussion board as a part of our shape and meaning unit. So we've already gone over our non-objective narrative zine project. Now we're going to do some initial sketches in our sketchbook to get started to generate some ideas. There's going to be a general overview of how to do that just now. And then I'm going to do one other video after this that's going to introduce a little bit more into the rough draft and your in progress upload. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go to Blackboard and open up discussion board 1, which we've already done to get to this video. And then we're going to look over the directions here. So these are just going to be preliminary sketches. You are not going to think so much about your zine format yet. This is really just you planning out what the pages of your story are going to look like. How are you going to start to use shapes to convey meaning? And even before that, you need to start thinking about what story or narrative you want to tell. So there's going to be some listing, some writing first in our first part of this. So for the part 1, I want you to write out 5 genres that interest you. So think this can be movie, book, comics, books, anything that, we can assign a genre to. And I want you to just list 5 that interest you. Then I want you to list 10 narratives. So any sort of story that you can think of off the top of your head. These can be movies, books, comics, personal stories from your life. Doesn't have to be something that someone else did. It can be fiction. It can be nonfiction. If it tells a sequence, it still works as a narrative, right? It could be a tutorial. It can be fairy tale, folk tale, wives' tale, video games, anything that tells a story, write it down. And then you're going to narrow down this a little bit. So you've got these 2 lists going. You're going to go down, you're going to narrow down your 10 narratives to 5. You're going to just X them out and say, okay, I want these 5. These are interesting. And then you're going to write next to those 5 some characters that you can identify from those narratives, right? So if we're going to do Little Red Riding Hood, okay, who are the characters? Well, there's the big bad wolf, there's grandma, and there's Little Red Riding Hood. You are literally just listing. If it's a video game, okay, who's the main character? What are some other characters you can think of? Just listing them out. Okay, so that's part 1. That's going to be on one piece of paper in your sketchbook. You can upload that list along with the submission. And I just want to point out here, why are we doing this? It's meant to just generate ideas. Don't overstress. Give yourself a time limit if you need to. So if you want to just record yourself and say, okay, in 5 minutes, I need to get this all done. Sometimes it's helpful to have time constraints when we're trying to think creatively. Okay, part 2, you're going to narrow down your 5 narratives, your 5 stories to 3. Okay, and on your next page, you're going to start to draw out a storyboard. Storyboard is sort of traditionally what we would see someone who's making a movie, for example, something, any sort of visual story. You can use a storyboard to start to plan what it's going to look like. So you're going to do a set of storyboard thumbnails for 3 narratives that you've picked from your list, okay? And you're going to start playing around with assigning those characters that you wrote out to some sort of non-objective shapes. So you're going to think about the personality of the character. Are they warm? Are they organic? Are they colorful? Are they more geometric in that they're more stern, more serious, or more stable? How can a shape convey those characters? Within these storyboard thumbnails, you're going to start to practice the shapes that these characters can be. You're also going to play around with what they're doing. So how the meaning and placement of these shapes can start to convey your story. And we're going to start by practicing this with 5 sort of compositions. Okay. So for example, since our minimum for our zine is going to be 5 pages, for our thumbnails, we're going to stick with just 5 examples or sort of 5 thumbnails, excuse me, that's going to have sort of the beginnings of our story. And again, don't overthink this. This is meant to be idea generation. It's not a rough draft. It's just idea generation. I just wanted to show you some examples of what this can look like as well, because some zines are going to be in a square or rectangular format, while some people might be interested in doing something more creative, more organic. So there's our 2 examples of students who have done these thumbnails. So I want you to just see how quick they're done, right? They sort of label them in the sequential story of like their characters are all these lines. They didn't even end up using this. It's just an example of what your idea generation for this discussion board can look like. On the right-hand side, this student chose to instead do squares just to make it more organic. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's 5 rows here that they are playing around with. So each page will have 5 sort of compositions on it or thumbnails that are starting to plan out your characters, what your characters do in each sort of frame or story, right? So 1, they're introduced to the thing. 2, they start to move around. Think about visual hierarchy. How do we invite the viewer in? How do we use these shapes to kind of get people conveyed and moving and thinking? Go back to the other lectures or the PowerPoint presentation to think about some of those strategies that you can use in your thumbnails. Okay, a few reminders. For our thumbnails, play around with some different black and white mediums. So you might want to play around with pencil a little bit. You might want to play around with pen or marker. You can even play around with some color. But remember, our rule is that 5% of each frame, so even within this tiny little frame, only 5% of that surface area can have color. And like we looked at in the past student examples, that color seems to be a great way to introduce the main character. Okay, so remember the compositional strategies that we discussed, visual hierarchy, I already said that. Each storyboard should take up at least one page in your sketchbook, already said that, okay? So you got a good example of what we're doing here. There is no shape or size requirement for how big or small you make these thumbnails. They just have to fill up the page, okay? Then you're gonna upload those images of those pages. So you should have 3 pages of thumbnails. And I also want you to upload your list page too. So you're gonna upload those to this discussion board and then you'll be done. Okay, and then we'll move on to discussion board 2 for our rough draft.